How might a Christian professor respond to the top 10 new atheist commandments?
How might an atheist respond to the disturbing news that we're putting out commandments for some reason?
I'm here with my son, Scotty.
Hey, Dad. Hey, Scotty, how are you, sport?
Who's going to ask me for my thoughts and my reactions.
You're the best evil son an evil dad could ever ask for.
You ready to go, buddy?
Let's do this thing.
Scotty's on fire.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. Maybe two former Christians? Eric, XJWs are former Christians, right?
Yeah, I absolutely do consider myself a former Christian. I'm an ex-Jehovah's Witness. I know many Christians take exception to that because Jehovah's Witnesses are Unitarians, and according to the Nicene Creed, if you're not a Trinitarian, you're obviously not a true Christian. But no, I consider myself a former Christian. I believed in Christ. I believed in the sacrifice that he supposedly made for me and the reasons behind it. I prayed to mostly the same God that other Christians prayed to. I just didn't think that Jesus was the same entity as that God.
All right. Well, Mr. Skeptics and Scoundrels and I are here to hear Sean address what he calls 10 atheist commandments. Let's go.
All right.
So this came from a CNN website article, and it was entitled, "Behold, Atheists' New 10 Commandments."
So already we're off to a bad start. Sean is talking about this CNN article here, but what he doesn't mention or what he doesn't realize is that this article is reporting on a survey held by two authors of a book called Atheist Mind, Humanist Heart, Rewriting the 10 Commandments for the 21st Century. Their names are Lex Bayer and John Figder. And what this article is reporting on is that these two gentlemen wrote a book where they do a ground-up reevaluation of the 10 Commandments. They figure straight from their presuppositions what presuppositions they should adopt, how they should use those to build higher logical systems, and then eventually come to a list of, and I quote from the book, 10 non-commandments for the 21st century. So we're going to see repeatedly in this video, quite to my chagrin, Sean will refer to these as the atheist 10 commandments because Sean is working off of a CNN article, which also refers to them as non-commandments. So I'm not sure how much Sean read this article, but Sean is working off of his interpretation of a CNN article's interpretation of the project that these two gentlemen engaged in, namely their book, and also a survey conducted on their website. So after the book was released and the book talks about the top 10 non-commandments for the 21st century, they had a survey in which readers and fans of the book and the website could submit their own commandments, and they would be rated and then selected from based off of some criteria, probably the most votes or most popular. So what Sean's actually referring to here is not an atheist 10 commandments. These are 10 non-commandments generated by a survey and vote. So we're going to see him act like these are some type of decree, some type of commandments by some authority figure, when really they're just generated by a bunch of enthusiastic people around this book. And the book itself actually talks quite a lot about this, about why that these should not be commandments. These are explicitly non-commandments. These are up to criticism. They're up to interpretation. They're up to reevaluation. These are not set in stone, and nor they should be. They're not from an authority figure. They're from two humans trying to figure out the world. I also find it telling that Sean didn't link the CNN article or the book in his video. In fact, he doesn't reference the book at all. He simply is referring to the article. He also consistently misrepresents these non-commandments as commandments, literally the opposite of their stated purpose. Curiously, in the video title and the description, the term non-commandments is used. This gives me the impression that somebody down the pipe from when this video was delivered realized their mistake and they were basically trying to backpedal in the video title and description. But that's just a speculation of mine. I find the difference between the way Sean refers to these so-called commandments and the way the video title refers to these non-commandments to be peculiar. In fact, I'm very convinced that Sean didn't even realize that there's a book behind this. He doesn't mention it at all. He doesn't talk about the authors or even the website where this particular survey was taken. And this is really, to me, Answers in Genesis level of laziness. Mislabel and misrepresent the viewpoint you're responding to. Don't link to the article, just refer to it with words. Don't mention the original book, the authors, the stated purpose. Don't mention that this list that they're going to address is the result of surveying literally thousands of people. Don't address the point that this was chosen by some type of arbitrary criteria, likely the number of votes. as such, are likely not going to have coherency in this list because this is sourced from multiple different people. And also don't mention that this is a side project to stress the point that the actual list from the book, the 10 non-commandments from the book that the two authors endorse, is not some type of authority, is not some type of dictate that needs to be just blindly followed. It's a list that can be changed and reasoned with and contrasted and compared against evidence and reevaluated. It's flexible. It's not some set of commandments, which Sean is trying to paint them as.
I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Old Testament, but there were two versions of the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament as well. So maybe God was doing a similar process with the angels in heaven. And, the first draft, the don't boil a goat in its mother's milk, that was on the list the first time, but it got downvoted for something else.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, the book actually references the point you just made here. The 10 Commandments in the Bible are not this clean list of 10 items that we see in courthouses and what we see in schools, unfortunately, and also what Sean and his son are likely going to think of when you hear the words 10 Commandments. The book very plainly points out that the 10 Commandments in the Bible are a bit of a mess. There's two references to them. One's in Exodus and one's in Deuteronomy. They aren't clear and concise. There's multiple interpretations for both of them. The original verses are less restrained than the Sunday school versions, with the colorful language and the threats and stuff. The commandments we see in the Bible are very different than what you actually think of when you go and ponder these things in the modern day Christian light.
I'm here with my son, Scotty, who's going to ask me for my thoughts and my reactions.
It really feels like Sean is using his son as a prop in this video. There's no real discussion taking place here. Sean instructs his kid to read the commandment, and he then gives a preachy lecture response to it, each one averaging between a minute and a half. I also like the tactical placement of Sean's book on the table. It has nothing to do with this conversation. He doesn't reference it at all. It's just there, just begging you to buy it. I thought that was funny. And Scotty, his son, will give some comments at the end, which I think are coming from a very genuine place. I think he is in a position where he wants to really impress his father. We can see him. He's sitting there. He's wearing his Biola University shirt. He's likely going to college and following the footsteps of his father, who followed in the footsteps of his grandfather. I can appreciate all that. I think a lot of us, we want to follow in our parents' footsteps and actually please them and make sure that they are proud of us. And I can completely understand that.
It's your son.
No.
He wants to take over the family business.
Scotty does?
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm glad this video only got 12,000 views because it's low effort. Answers in Genesis level junk, in my opinion.
Atheist commandment number 1.
Be open-minded and be willing to alter your beliefs with new evidence.
I actually love that it starts here because this is an area that Christians and atheists can find some common ground. I think it's built into the scriptures that we should follow evidence, that we should believe what is true and reject what is false. So there's some Christians who are open-minded, willing to alter their beliefs, and there's some that are not. There's some atheists who are open-minded and willing to follow their beliefs, and some who are not. But bottom line, commandment number 1, love it. That's good common ground across worldviews.
So here Sean says that he likes to find common ground with atheists. And I agree with him. I think finding common ground between people with two different viewpoints is a good and productive manner to open up communication, exchange ideas, and hopefully as a team come a little bit closer to what the truth actually is. But to me, it doesn't matter if it is quote, built into the scriptures that we should follow evidence. In fact, there are scriptures in which we need to believe things without proper evidence, which in my opinion is antithetical to the notion that we should follow evidence to where things lead. So I guess I would ask Sean, what if tomorrow you realize that the Bible isn't a reliable source of guidance or truth? Would you then reject the notion that you should follow evidence to where it would lead? No, I doubt you would. I think you would keep valuing evidence and following it to where it leads, independent of what the Bible actually tells you. I'm an atheist, and I don't believe the Bible is a good guide for anything, and I value following evidence. If it is indeed, quote, built into the scriptures, then that means the writers appreciated that fact before the scriptures were written, and that means that the scriptures are not necessary to draw that conclusion. Putting all of these things together, we'd have to conclude that following the evidence is just worthwhile on its own, independent of what the Bible does or does not say about it. The bottom line is the Bible is unnecessary for this evaluation, and I would even say worthless in the discussion about following evidence.
Atheist commandment number 2.
Strive to understand what is most likely to be true, not to believe what you wish to be true.
Okay, again, I love it. And this is a human issue for every worldview. We're all tempted to want to believe the things that fit our narrative that we want to be true, reject things that are inconvenient. Again, these first two, I agree. I would say amen to my atheist friends. But embedded in this is that we ought to follow truth for its own sake. I don't know where that obligation comes from within an atheist worldview.
So Sean loves this commandment. Great. I like this commandment too. I think our belief should be informed by evidence and by reasoning and where our systems of logic take us, not based on what we wish to believe. But I find it funny. There's a humorous lack of self-awareness in his comments here. Basically that people are prone to confirmation bias and they are resistant to conflicting evidence. I could be suffering from confirmation bias in pretty much anything. I'm not immune to it myself. But I would love to ask Sean about how much he wants Christianity to be true, how much he needs Christianity to be true, and then compare that to how much that I want atheism to be true, for lack of a better term. I derive no hope, meaning, or purpose from my atheism, my lack of a belief in a God. Even if I was a strong atheist, and I probably am when considering Sean's Christian triomni God, I don't derive any positives from that, other than knowing that that monster doesn't exist. I get those from other sources, but not my disbelief in a God. In fact, the only thing I enjoy from my atheism is intellectual integrity, despite the promises and threats of Christianity and other religions. In fact, if Sean or one of his cohorts could demonstrate tomorrow that a God exists, I'd be quite excited. I'd have one fewer false position, being atheism. I'd have a new frontier of knowledge to explore. The supernatural would suddenly become possible for explaining things. A new life form, God, will have been discovered, and things like life, death, and meaning would take on completely new lines of reasoning and questioning. I'd have quite a lot to gain if theism were proven true. On the other hand, Christians like Sean have so much to lose if it turns out that their idea of a God does not exist. Not that just a God doesn't exist, but their particular flavor of God doesn't exist. I don't want to put words in Sean's mouth, but I anticipate that some, if not most Christians, would lose hope, meaning, and purpose in their lives. They're never going to see their loved ones again. They're never going to live without certain permanent illnesses that plague them. In Sean's case, he'd have to come to the terms with the fact that his father wasted his life studying and pursuing a falsehood. He wasted his life studying and pursuing a falsehood. And from the looks of it, his son will have wasted his future life studying and pursuing a falsehood. His source of income and clout would evaporate overnight, and he would have quite a lot of egg on his face were he to admit publicly that he was wrong about his life's work. And he makes the comment that we ought to follow truth for its own sake, and he's not sure how atheists can come to that conclusion. Well, Sean, had you read the book that the CNN article is referencing, the authors actually talk about this. They start with their presuppositions. They start with what can be demonstrated to be true. And then they use logic and a reasoned system to build those 10 non-commandments on top of that. Whereas on the flip side, what is Sean's source for why we should follow truth for its own sake? Well, he thinks his God said it.
Now, then, Christian worldview, there's a God who's designed us to build a certain way. He's given us reliable faculties that we ought to follow. In atheist worldview, we have bubbled up through a purposeless material evolutionary process, and truth helps us instrumentally navigate the world. But I'm not sure you can make the argument within an atheist worldview that truth in itself is objectively good and we ought to follow it.
So just the concept that we ought to follow truth for its own sake, we can argue for many different vantage points about why that is beneficial for us. If the goal for us is flourishing, then obviously an accurate understanding of our reality promotes flourishing. An inaccurate understanding will diminish our flourishing. And Sean here appeals to an objective standard, which his God simply put forward.
Atheist commandment number 3.
The scientific method is the most reliable way of understanding the natural world.
I loved this one because Sean is about to say 3 very silly things in a row here.
The claim is the scientific method is the most reliable way of understanding the natural world. That is a claim that's not a scientific claim. You cannot test that claim through the scientific method.
Okay, go ahead. So silly claim number 1. You cannot test the claim the scientific method is the most reliable way to understand the world with the scientific method, as if that somehow disqualifies a scientific method from being the most reliable way to investigate things. This is patently false and also wrong. This is a scientifically testable claim. We can test it and it can be falsified. For example, We can line up 10, 100, or even 1,000 currently unanswered questions. And in a controlled manner, we can have two parties working on finding those answers. The first party can be a set of scientists out and using the scientific method to investigate, using the scientific process. They can test, they can revise, draw conclusions, and peer review. The other group can be people who pray to a god, wait for divine revelation, or simply ask God to appear and just give the answer. We can compare these two groups and actually rate their performance to see who solves the most problems. In fact, I'm willing to bet that between one scientist and 1 million prayer sayers, the scientist will win.
I'm not taking that bet.
This very commandment concedes that there's other very important and valuable non-scientific ways of understanding the world.
No, Sean, it does not concede that. It does acknowledge the existence of other methods, but it says nothing about their efficacy, other than they fall short of science.
Now, there's big common ground here in the value of science between atheists and between Christians. There's no coincidence that the greatest scientific pioneers, whether it's Pascal, Boyle, Newton, Pasteur, Galileo, were theists, most Christians.
And the third silly thing Sean says here is that it's no coincidence that the greatest scientific pioneers were theists, most Christians. I don't even know what his point here is. Is he saying that their Christianity, and in reality he's talking about God, was somehow integral to their discoveries? I mean, sure, their theism might have motivated them to study the world. They might have gotten their funding from religious institutes. They might have been able to only publish through religiously controlled papers. We don't know. But I would like Sean to explain to me how the belief in a God actually contributed to these discoveries. And notice Sean did a sneaky here. He acknowledged that they were mostly Christian, which means Sean is conceding that some great scientific minds were not Christian. Would Sean say that the religions of the ancient Babylon and Egypt somehow helped in the development of algebra? Einstein was asked by many people about what his religion was, and he said, just call me an agnostic. He wasn't a Christian. And he developed both the special and general theories of relativity, revolutionizing our world. In these cases, Christianity wasn't needed. Sean should know better than this. Maybe he does, and he's just playing to his audience? I don't know. No, atheism does not state that the natural world is all that exists. Philosophical naturalism versus methodological naturalism is a discussion about whether the natural world is all that exists. Atheism is independent of either of those because you can have an atheist philosophical naturalist and also an atheist methodological naturalist.
We agree that science is a powerful way of understanding the natural world. But within this worldview, the natural world is all that exists. And of course, I believe there's other kinds of knowledge and things beyond the physical natural world that are real.
So here Sean says that he believes that there are other forms of knowledge and other methodologies for coming to truth. Well, Sean, I'm sorry. I don't care what you believe. I care what you can demonstrate. Can you show us that there are other methods of coming to this type of knowledge? Can you show us that there are other realms of belief or what have you? Show me one instance of something, quote, beyond the natural world. And saying that I just know it or that I know it doesn't help the conversation at all. Have you ever known something with a capital K and then later found out you were wrong? How do you know that's not occurring to you right now?
And I would argue like moral faculties. I know as much as I know anything in the world that it's wrong to torture a child for fun. I know that as clearly as I do any scientific statement.
The strength of your conviction does nothing to tell you or me whether or not that conviction is true. And regarding your knowledge that torturing a child for fun is always immoral, all we have to do is add the preface to it that God commanded you to do this.
It is possible that God could command something so intuitively immoral as walking into a primary school and shooting it up or something.
It is possible for God to issue commands that would override what our moral duties are. So,
Sure.
yeah, I would say that it is possible.
So Sean says that he knows that it is wrong to torture a child for fun. Well, let's break that down into torturing a child and also torturing a child for fun. And let's compare and see what happens when God commands either. So I agree with Sean. It is wrong to torture a child for fun, but that's built off of my moral system in which my goals are subjectively chosen. Namely, I want to see humans flourish. I want to see suffering reduced and a whole host of other things which promote those core objectives. Those are my subjectively chosen goals. With those in mind now, I am able to objectively evaluate actions that either get me closer or further away from those goals. So in a sense, I can say, yes, it is objectively wrong to torture a child for fun because it gets me further away from my subjectively chosen goals. Now let's look at Sean's system. Sean is appealing to what he knows, but he says that what he knows is ingrained and programmed into him by his God. But we have cases in the Bible where children are tortured. We had Midianite and Canaanite children put to the sword solely because God says we need that land or their religion offends us. So it's wrong to torture a child unless God commands you to. Does that also mean that it's wrong to torture a child for fun, but when God commands you to torture a child for fun, it suddenly becomes right? I would say yes, because from Sean's point of view, anything God tells you to do would by default be moral.
Atheist commandment number 4.
Every time Sean looks at the camera and he says, atheist commandment number such and such, he's screaming to the audience that he did not actually look at the source material where this list is coming from.
Every person has the right to control of their body.
Okay, now, as Christians, I would agree that we have bodily autonomy, but I think we all recognize that our right to our own body is limited when we're going to harm another human being. So I can drive my car where I want to, but I cannot drive it on the sidewalk legally or morally because I very much might harm somebody else. I don't have the moral right to go naked and go running through the middle of where we live because people would say you're harming me even if I don't physically touch them. I do find it interesting that some of the main people who made this argument, and this was pre-COVID, will turn around and say you have the right to bodily autonomy, but you have to wear a mask. Now, I'm not making a point whether you should wear a mask or not make a mask, but to say that somebody else should wear a mask because you might harm somebody else with your body is to concede that there's limitations on bodily autonomy.
I agree with the statement here that we have rights to bodily autonomy as long as we aren't harming other human beings in the process. You can actually drive your car on a sideway legally and morally in some extreme cases. Some communities allow cars to park on sidewalks. Emergency vehicles can drive on sidewalks. Exceptions can't be made in times of extreme emergencies, like a disaster or transporting someone to the hospital. This is a poor example of bodily autonomy. I like how in one sentence, he talks about how his bodily autonomy doesn't cover his refusal to wear clothing, but then he turns right around and starts talking about the refusal to wear a face mask in the middle of an epidemic. Why would he not have the moral right to run naked through the neighborhood, but he does have the moral right to refuse to wear a mask? I'm not sure if that's necessarily the point he's making here. In fact, I think he said that he is not making a statement about this, but why even bring this up? He would have been better off talking about vaccines and whether or not someone should be compelled to put something into their body for the good of the community.
So obviously this is being applied to abortion. I'd say a woman has the right to do whatever she wants to with her own body if the unborn is not human. And the science is very clear that it is.
The pro-choice arguments from bodily autonomy are not related to the humanity of the unborn. The violinist analogy is often used, presenting a hypothetical scenario where you wake up connected to a famous unconscious violinist. The violinist's survival depends on being connected to your body for 9 months. Advocates of pro-choice point out that you could choose to stay connected to the violinist, but bodily autonomy gives you the right to disconnect if you wish. You are not legally or morally obligated to use your body to keep the violinist alive, even though they are fully human.
Atheist commandment number 5.
God is not necessary to be a good person or to live a full and meaningful life.
Okay, so it depends on what's meant by God is not necessary. It's not necessary to believe in God. Even as a Christian, I would say atheists can and often are moral. As a Christian, I'd say because they're made in God's image and still live in God's world. The real question is, can you have the idea of being a good person and living an objectively meaningful life if there is no God?
I'm very intrigued at his reference to, I quote, an objectively meaningful life. To me, this is a contradiction in terms. Objective means independent of the mind, but meaning is the value placed upon something by a mind. I don't see how these two words can go together and make any sense. Does gold have objective meaning? No. Does air have objective meaning or purpose? No. The meaning and value placed upon things are done by minds relative to goals that the mind has subjectively chosen. I wish to survive. I need air to survive. Therefore, breathing air is meaningful to me. A meaningful life is one that is looked back on by the person who lived it and then considered worthwhile, fulfilling, and satisfying. Sean would likely argue that a full and meaningful life is one spent in reverence to his God, but that would be his opinion. And if he would say that it's not an opinion, but it's God's decree that a life is full and meaningful as long as it's spent in reverence to that God, then that would make it God's opinion. There could be a God that exists that could easily say that reverence to him has no effect on the meaningfulness of life. I think one of the biggest things that annoy me about Christians is how they try to slap the term objective on the opinions of their God. And it's actually a little worse than that because it's the Christian's opinion on the opinion of their God. For me, it's right up there with people who use the word literally and ironically wrong. So even with Sean's God, I don't see how you can get to an objective morality or objective meaning. Why does it have to be objective to be valuable? What good is your garden if fairies don't live under it? Am I right?
Atheist commandment number 6.
Be mindful of the consequences of all your actions and recognize that you must take responsibility for them.
Okay, in some ways, this is great. This is a human principle. I totally agree. But what this does is we often hear people say things like, hey, to each his own, you do whatever you want to do. But then what does this say? Be mindful of the consequences of your actions and take responsibility for them. So in some ways, this is contradicting an earlier principle. It says, I have, authority over my own body. But now they're saying, oh, actually, you are supposed to make certain actions because you have responsibility how it affects others. So I agree with the principle. I think there's just a little bit of tension built into these top 10 atheist commandments.
So again, this just simply shows how Sean did not read the source material that he's addressing. These are not commandments. These are explicitly non-commandments. When Sean says that people say that you should do whatever you want to do, you do you, who really says that in the most absolute sense? I have never encountered anybody who says that you should just do whatever you want, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the people you affect, regardless of anything. This is a colloquialism that we use every day, but we all understand that we're not taking this to the extreme. And he also says that this contradicts one of the previous commandments in this 10 list. Sean, again, these are not commandments, but they're non-commandments. And why are you expecting coherency here? If you had read the article, you would have known that this is generated by a survey. There is no coherency because this wasn't a formal study. This wasn't formally put together by authors who were researching this. This is just, hey, we wrote a book. What do you think? What do you think should be a non-commandment? So yeah, Sean, because this is a list and product of a survey and vote. You'd know that if you had read the article or looked at the website linked in the article, or better yet, read the book. I did. It was really good and would address a lot of your contentions. How would it look if we surveyed 3,000 Christians on the street, misunderstood, misinterpreted, and then misrepresented their positions, and then criticized how they aren't coherent? I think folks would rightly call that stupid.
Atheist commandment number 7.
Treat others as you would want them to treat you and can reasonably expect them to want to be treated.
So in some ways, this is the golden rule, which is not unique to Christianity. You see it in Judaism. C.S. Lewis has documented in other cultures throughout the history of the world. In fact, you see it in Buddhism and even in Scientology. I think where I would maybe push back is it says, treat them as you can reasonably expect them to want to be treated. I'm not exactly sure what's meant by reasonably. Bottom line, a Christian view of love is that I am to be committed to your objective best. That's what it means to be loving. Now, sometimes people might resist that. We are to do what's objectively loving for them. So I think there's a lot of common ground. I just would want this fleshed out a little bit more.
So I'm glad that Sean here admits that the golden rule did not originate in Christianity. In fact, Christianity borrows a lot of its concepts and teachings from other religions, monotheism, motifs borrowed from classic literature, virgin birth, sacrifice, followers. But I find it peculiar how Sean doesn't seem to know how we can reasonably expect what another person would want. So, Sean, we can figure out what is reasonable by thinking it through. We know that humans are generally the same, no matter who you talk to. We all need food, water, warmth, shelter, and to avoid injury in order to survive. Nearly universally, we all want things like love, comfort, stability, health, and not to be violated in one sense or another. So because of this, Sean, I can reasonably infer that you don't want to be assaulted. You don't want your car vandalized, or you and your family infected by COVID because somebody didn't wear a mask. It's not that hard. In fact, the book that you didn't read goes into those details of how to build ground up a moral system which considers these aspects and justifies them. Whereas on the flip side, Sean's justification is just, God said so, divine dictate.
I feel like the people who participated in this survey were likely wanting to create a version of a platinum rule, which is better than a golden rule. Golden rule having the common loophole. Jesus said, do unto others what you would have them do unto you, where, of course, some people are willing to endure some hardship that other people aren't. And that's the traditional loophole in Jesus' version. So I see how the people were trying to strengthen the Jesus version into a platinum version. I'm not sure they got there. There's other versions out there, but Sean seems to be oblivious to this loophole in his own book.
So Sean says, quote, the Christian view of love is that I am committed to your objective best. But what one's objective best is relative to the goals being pursued. Would Sean consider these cases to be objectively loving? The Israelites slaughtering and murdering the Midianites and the Canaanites? The ownership of slaves and the passing of slaves from generation to generation? Or the misogyny and male dominance in the Bible, where women are essentially second-class citizens and relegated to property? So from Sean's point of view, Christian love here is being committed to one's objective best up until that comes into conflict with his God's commandments, in which case what's objectively best no longer is a criteria to be considered because God's dictate trumps all. Essentially, Christian love is suspended when God says so. What stops this God tomorrow from telling his followers to murder and pillage neighboring towns? He did it once before. Who says he can't do it again?
Atheist commandment number 8.
We have the responsibility to consider others, including future generations.
I love it. I totally agree that we have a responsibility to consider others, including future generations. I just don't know where that responsibility and that moral obligation comes from if there's not a God. So I agree with the atheists. Many atheists do this, and I commend them for it. And a lot of Christians don't. But I want to know where that duty to have responsibility to our posterity comes from. There's not a God. I don't see it.
So Sean and I are in agreement here. We do have a responsibility to consider others, including future generations. But Sean doesn't know where this comes from. Sean, we talked about this. Had you read the book, you would know the point of view or the starting point that the atheist is starting from here. The obligations come from an evaluation of subjectively chosen goals, coupled with the objective evaluation of how actions can get us closer or further away from those goals. And you cannot derive an ought from an is. We can determine courses of actions which are beneficial or detrimental to our goals once we have those goals in place and we have experience to help us determine whether those actions will actually get us closer to those goals. And here Sean also admits that Christians can fall short of the dictates of their God when it comes to morality. Thanks for admitting that Christianity fails to teach all people to be good.
Atheist commandment number 9.
There's no one right way to live.
Now, it depends on what you mean, no one right way. Even in the Bible, it talks about not judging certain people because people have different kinds of liberty when it comes to choices that they make. There's also differences in spiritual gifts that people might have.
I feel like he meant to say also different genitals in there, but he didn't.
So we're unique. We have different professions, but I do find it somewhat in tension with the other ones that are telling us certain ways that we should live and says there's no one right way to live. Clearly, atheists think that the atheist worldview is correct and we ought to conform our lives to it, including this list.
Sean should know that atheism is not a worldview. There's no conforming our lives to it. Until a God appears and explains to us why our lives should conform to that God's commandments, lives should be lived independent of considerations to God or gods. And the same would go for leprechauns, Loki, and fairies that definitely live in the tree in my backyard. Saying that there's no right way to live is an admission that people's opinions about what makes them happy and flourish is subjective.
Atheist commandment number 10.
Leave the world a better place than when you found it.
Love it. I agree. And I know many atheists personally who are doing this. In fact, I know many who are doing it better than Christians are doing it. But built into this is that we have a duty, an obligation, a commandment to actually do so.
I said it once, I said it again, and I'm going to say it a third time. These are not commandments.
And this implies that there's better ways to live, hence leave the world a better place and less better places. If there's no God and there's no design and there's no purpose, I don't know objectively what better is where I have a duty to do so. That's where I think it kind of falls short.
I think the world would be a better place without Christianity. And I'm constantly intrigued by this fixation on Christian objective morality, duties, meaning, and worth. Does Sean really think he'd be worthless without some God to tell him otherwise?
I think there's a ton of common ground here between Christians and between atheists. What's embedded in this list, though, are certain ideas that are not as at home in an atheist worldview as they are a Christian worldview.
So what concepts is he trying to lay claim to here in the name of Christianity? There does not have to be a higher source, Sean. That's your incredulity talking. Saying that it doesn't make sense without a God, so there must be a God, because that's your assessment, doesn't make it true. And Sean, finally, once again, these are not commandments. You would have known that had you read the article or the book. Sure, commandments point to a commander, but these are not commandments.
Commandments kind of seem to point towards a commander. And I'm curious, what do you think?
Oh, his kid can talk now with 35 seconds left in the video. I love it. Poor Scotty.
Poor Scotty.
Scotty, take it down a notch.
Well, as I look at these 10, I would love to talk to different atheists about this, because Christians unanimously agree on the 10 commandments. I would have a hard time believing that every single atheist would agree with all 10 of these.
Okay, so there's a weird cut here, but I think he just said that all Christians agree upon the 10 commandments, and I think we can safely say that's false. The 10 commandments in the Bible, as I mentioned earlier, are not cut and dry. There's multiple interpretations. They're kind of wordy. They're not like what you see in those courthouses and in the schools. And obviously, every atheist wouldn't agree with this list we went over in this video here, because again, this is the result of a survey and a poll. Had Sean and Scotty here actually read the book that Lex Bayer and John Figdor wrote, it would very plainly lay out the following. These are not commandments. They are educated and thought out conclusions from two people who deeply pondered the assumptions, questions, ethics, and implication that these non-commandments would have. They are up for criticism and revision. They're not set in stone. These are not decrees or commands. Nothing in the book tells you that this is the right way to live. That's your dad's straw man you're addressing.
So did the book have its own 10 commandments?
Yes, in fact, it did. In fact, the 10 non-commandments for the 21st century are as follows. Non-commandment 1, the world is real, and our desire to understand the world is the basis for belief. Non-commandment 2, we can perceive the world only through our human senses. Non-commandment 3, we use rational thought and language as tools for understanding the world. Non-commandment 4, all truth is proportional to the evidence. Non-commandment 5, there is no God. Non-commandment 6, we all strive to live a happy life. We pursue things that make us happy and avoid things that do not. Non-commandment 7, there is no universal moral truth. Our experiences and preferences shape our sense of how to behave. Non-commandment 8, we act morally when the happiness of others makes us happy. Non-commandment 9, we benefit from living in and supporting an ethical society. Non-commandment 10, all our beliefs are subject to change in the face of new evidence, including these. So Sean, had you actually read this book, you would have realized that these are not commandments. They're not set in stone. In fact, non-commandment 10 says that all of this is subject to change, including these 10 non-commandments. These are not universal decrees from a dictator. These are not objective moral truths. These are reasonable evaluations done by humans trying to make the best in the world that they can.
That list is far superior. And now I wish that Sean had addressed that list rather than the follow-up survey list.
It would have been far more interesting, but also far more challenging to Sean. And I don't think that's what Sean's out to do. He's not out to challenge himself on these things. He is generating a video for his subscribers to consume and reaffirm their belief in their God.
Well, thank you so much, Eric, for coming and thanks so much for doing the homework so that we didn't have to. But now I want to read this book.
Absolutely. And just a reminder, this book is entitled Atheist Mind, Humanist Heart, Rewriting the 10 Commandments for the 21st Century. It was written by authors Lex Bayer and John Figdor. It is an interesting ground-up construction of what 10 non-commandments for the 21st century would look like, starting with your presuppositions, how we evaluate the world, the assumptions we make as starting points, and building from there into how do we evaluate the world, how do we evaluate evidence. And then from there, the author is talking about what we ought to do if we have certain goals. I do recommend this. You can find this on Amazon. I really enjoyed reading it, and I recommend you do it too.
More importantly, If you haven't already, you should go check out Eric's Skeptics and Scoundrels YouTube channel, where he calmly and intellectually examines all kinds of topics related to religion and deconstruction. Find the link in the description and tell him that Paulogia sent you.
I appreciate this. This was really fun.
Until next time, later.